When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Castle Church door in Wittenberg, he had no idea what a firestorm of controversy he had set in motion. As he would later say, he couldn't believe what a scrap of paper could do.
He was a university professor. He was posting basically a proposal for a debate. He hoped to have a lively discussion there at the university in Wittenberg based on his 95 Theses. There's lots to discuss there. But what happened is that someone translated them into German, and they got printed. And pretty soon they were circulating around Germany within a matter of weeks, and then shortly around Europe. And suddenly, this was something really big. It wasn't just a university proposal for a debate.
Luther didn't set out to try to change the church or try to reform the church. He didn't have such grand ambitions. His hope was to simply save his people from some of the nonsense going on of these indulgences and these indulgence hawkers like Tetzel.
I think it's important to remember that for several years after the posting of the 95 Theses, Luther publicly was very respectful toward the Pope. He hoped that the Pope would see the validity of his critique. But as you can imagine, in these years, there was also a sort of rising thought within Martin Luther, what is this papacy? What is really going on there?
So when Luther starts challenging Tetzel, Tetzel does not take it lying down. He comes back, and Tetzel's a pretty shrewd guy and pretty sharp himself. And his ace is to accuse Luther of heresy because Luther is starting to challenge the authority of the Pope. And Tetzel picks up on this. This is he sees as the weak point for Luther because he can now accuse Luther of being a Hussite.
John Huss, about 100 years prior, had challenged the authority of the Pope and had been burned at the stake at the Council of Constance in 1415 for his troubles.
So John Huss is not a happy figure in the Roman Catholic Church. So when Tetzel, in a sense, plays the John Huss card, he's really upping the ante, and he's going right at Luther with this charge because this is serious business now.
The Augustinian order to which Luther belonged was generally supportive of him. But when the 95 Theses reached the Pope in Rome, he said, Luther's a drunken German. He'll think differently when he's sober. So Pope Leo appointed a new general of the Augustinian order in hopes to, as he said, smother the fire before it becomes a conflagration.
Luther's opponents were hopeful that a little bit of noise on their part would just shut him up. Staupitz, Luther's superior, decided that he would put Luther on the biggest stage that he could at the time, the annual meeting of the Observant Augustinian Order in Heidelberg in 1518. Luther goes to that event with a set of theses, nothing about the sale of indulgences, nothing about Tetzel, nothing about the flap that has ensued. Luther takes this opportunity to place his theology in the broadest context possible.
And in the Heidelberg Disputation, what Luther starts to advance is a teaching of the theology of the cross and the idea that the cross challenges and undoes everything that makes sense to us, everything that seems reasonable to us. And now in Heidelberg, he's getting to the point where he's even challenging the idea that somehow we can earn our way into God's forgiveness or that our good works count before God. And he's beginning to realize not at all. In fact, it's our brokenness, which is our reality, and our need for God's forgiveness. So something has happened significantly even in that time period between the 95 Theses and the Heidelberg Disputation.
He is rejecting all kinds of triumphalism. He's rejecting works righteousness. He specifically rejects the formula of do what is in you.
It's becoming more and more apparent that Luther is going to challenge the church's practices and he's going to challenge the way things are done. And it's not going to be a matter of tweaking a few things, but it's going to really demand an overturning of all kinds of junk that had found its way into the church. And in a sense, Luther starts pulling on one thing and realizing everything's coming with it. And it's going to be bigger than he ever anticipated, but that's what's starting to come clear to him.
And that's why the Heidelberg Disputation and Theses of 1518 are, if anything, much more significant than the 95 Theses of 1517.
Pope Leo X appointed a Dominican scholar named Prierius to head up a commission to respond to Luther. Now, the Dominicans and the Augustinians had a rivalry of sorts, and because of that, Luther and Prierius exchanged some testy letters. But Prierius had no idea what he was getting into. I mean, Luther was a skillful writer and he had a wicked sense of humor. In fact, he finally advised Prierius not to make himself look any more ridiculous by continuing to write.
Prierius isn't just anybody. Prierius is a high official in Rome. And that means this is getting more and more serious.
The Pope was completely intolerant at this point of Luther's teaching, was not willing to be patient, demanded of Frederick the Wise, the elector, and the one who was responsible for the University of Wittenberg, that he deliver up Luther, this child of the devil.
Frederick the Wise wanted to see a fair hearing for Luther, and that could happen only on German soil. And so the Holy See sent Cardinal Cajetan to Augsburg to interview Luther and to try to dissuade him from his pernicious heresy. The hearing before Cardinal Cajetan was really not much of a dispute of any kind, because Cajetan simply drew the line, Martin Luther, you must immediately concede on all these points, and Luther would simply not recant. And so there was a stalemate, and so then Luther was left in an indeterminate state in Augsburg. After midnight one evening, Luther rode off on horseback to get back to the safety of electoral Saxony. Incidentally, he arrived back in Wittenberg on the first anniversary of his posting the 95 Theses. This would now be October 31st, 1518.
Frederick the Wise got Luther to meet with a representative from Rome by the name of Karl von Miltitz. Now, Miltitz was supposed to coordinate his mission with that of Cajetan, but he got there after Luther had already had his meeting with Cajetan in Augsburg. But this was a great opportunity for Frederick to kind of muddy the waters and delay the proceedings against Luther. He has Luther go into Miltitz and say, look, I'll cooperate. I won't say anything against my opponents as long as they won't say anything against me. But Luther still doesn't take anything back. He later wrote to the elector and said, look, I'd be happy to recant if they'd just show me where I'm wrong.
In the summer of 1519, Luther attends another debate in Leipzig. This time, the stakes are getting even higher. He's debating a former friend, Johann von Eck, a theology professor at the University of Ingolstadt.
And let me tell you about debates at this time. They were not like American presidential debates where you're simply answering the same question in two different ways. No, these debates lasted, in this case, 18 days. And so the debate went on, and it was a knockdown, drag-out process in which Eck very cleverly maneuvered Luther into admitting that the teachings of John Huss, all of them, should not have been condemned by the church.
Luther had now crossed the line. He had been maneuvered into agreeing with some of the doctrines that were taught by John Huss, a heretic who'd been burned at the stake 100 years earlier.
And then, of course, the cry goes up, death to Luther, the Saxon Huss, and so on. And so at the end of the debate, Luther and Karlstadt go back to Wittenberg, and it was left to the theological schools, including Paris, to decide who won the debate.
In fact, later judgments from two Catholic theological faculties favored Eck, but popular opinion really favored Luther.
And now Eck then traveled to Rome to secure a papal bull, a decree that declared Luther a heretic.
You know, it's interesting, in Christian history, a lot of things have gotten called what they're called now as a term of derision. And Eck started calling Lutherans as a term of derision, that they're following Luther, not following the authority of the Pope.
The Leipzig debate proved significant for several reasons. Up to that point, much of the Reformers' talk had been around the whole issue of indulgences and the sacrament of penance. The Leipzig debate opened up the question of authority. Luther had been maneuvered into denying neither Pope nor Council was the ultimate authority in the Church.
January of 1519, Maximilian the Emperor finally dies, And that takes pressure from Luther because the papal diplomats have to concentrate their efforts, ensuring a friendly candidate receives the emperor's crown.
After the Leipzig debate, Luther starts writing things that are intended for an even more broad audience, because he's got this message of the gospel now really fully formed in his mind from his study of the scriptures. And he wants to bring it to as many people as possible and enlist the lay people as much as he can.
And these are important doctrinal theses because we still study them today. They're just spot on with this theology. And what's become clear now is he sees a need for reform in the church, and he's realizing the church is not up for this. It's not going to be coming from the hierarchy in Rome.
So he writes a treatise on good works, among other things to show that despite his detractors, he's not against good works. He writes a treatise to the Christian nobility of the German nation.
He actually calls on the Christian nobility and asks the princes to intervene for the sake of the church. He says, all right, if the Pope won't do it, you princes, you do it. And this was shocking to the world at that time.
He writes on the Babylonian captivity of the church, which is a thoroughgoing treatment of the church's sacramental system. And finally, a more positive statement of what he wanted his theology to say if all these people would just keep out of his way, and that was his treatise on the freedom of a Christian. These all come out in the year 1520.
While Luther is writing these, Eck and others in Rome were writing the document that the Pope would send to Germany. It was called a bull because attached to the document was the papal seal. In Latin, the word for seal is bulla, and therefore it was called a bull.
Eck returns to Germany with papal bull in hand. Exsurge Domini gave Luther a 60-day notice that he would be excommunicated if he did not return to the Roman obedience.
The Pope issued the bull on June 15, 1520, but Luther didn't receive it until October. Then 60 days later, on December 10, 1520, Luther gathered with a large crowd of students and they publicly burned the bull, along with the canon law of the Catholic Church. You see, Luther believed that he too was going to be burned at the stake, just like John Huss. Charles V, who was only 20 years old when he became the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he had a lot of issues to deal with. The most pressing was the possible invasion of the Turks from the east. And so he needed the Germans and their armies. And while he had a lot of political issues with them, he also had to deal with this monk named Luther. So he wanted to gather together the electors and the princes of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nations. And he decided to do it with a diet or an assembly. And he wanted to gather this assembly in 1521 at the city of Worms. Before the diet, because Luther burned the bull, the Pope had him excommunicated. Now, Charles V received that document on January 18th, and he received it with the instructions that he was to announce it to the Diet and he was to issue a ban against Luther, which was in essence his death sentence. The Diet started in late January 1521, and in early February, Charles V presented the ban to the Diet against Luther. But 4 days later, he was told that to condemn Luther without a hearing could lead to a riot, even a revolution. So he withdrew the ban, and he summoned Luther to appear before the Diet himself.
When Luther is summoned to the Diet of Worms, his prince, Elector Frederick, is immediately concerned about Luther's safety. And it was questionable whether Luther was going to make it to and from Worms in one piece. So Elector Frederick goes to the new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and after all, as one of the electors of the empire, he had been one of the people who put Charles into that position. So he's in the position to ask, as it were, for a favor. And he secures a safe conduct for Luther to and from the Diet of Worms.
When Luther arrived in Worms on April 16th, he found massive crowds hailing him. He was extremely popular at that time because by now he's famous throughout Germany. He had stopped the flow of good German Gulden going over the Alps to feed Rome. And so he was a hero among many Roman Catholics as well. And so he was greeted as a conquering hero, the German Hercules who had arrived. And it's probably one of the most dramatic scenes that we find in all of the history of the second millennium AD. I know of no scene that's more dramatic than this one. We have not only the secular powers represented by His Imperial Majesty Charles V and all the princes, both Catholic and Lutheran in Germany, but also all the church people and their representatives as well. It was a banner occasion. Nevertheless, Luther's case was shoved off to 4 p.m. the next day because that was unimportant, they felt, compared to the great business of the Holy Roman Empire. Little did they know. At 4 o'clock, Luther was brought in before this august assembly, and indeed the interlocutor at the time was named John Eck, of all things. It's a different John Eck, as a matter of fact, who acted as the prosecutor. And he pointed to a table full of books and writings, and he says, "Dr. Luther, are these yours?" And Luther quickly looked through them and said, "I think so." But then the interlocutor said, "Will you now, before God in this august assembly, deny everything you've written?"
And Luther says, "I want to give a good answer. Could I have some more time to think about it?" More time to think about it? You've had all this time. But all right, you can have 24 more hours.
So the next day he shows up again. And indeed, the same dialogue takes place.
Are these his books? Yes, they are. Is he going to recant these writings, take them back? He says, well, that's a difficult question to answer. They come in several categories. There are some that teach basic Christian truth. And even my opponents, in many cases, have lauded those. In some cases, I have attacked error. And if I were to take those back, I would be complicit in misleading people and tyranny. I'm not going to do that. And there are some where I have attacked individuals, and maybe I've gone too far in attacking certain individuals, and for that I'm sorry. But he's still not taking anything back. And finally, his inquisitor says, you still haven't answered the question. Are you going to take this stuff back?
Luther answered, "Since then your majesty and your lordships desire a simple reply, I will give you one without horns and without teeth." Well, we've lost that idiom. It means I'm going to give you a straight answer.
Luther said, unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, for I do not trust either in the Pope or in councils alone, since it is well known that they have often erred and contradicted themselves. I am bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. Here I stand. I can do no other. May God help me. Amen.
Silence blankets the hall. Of course, now it's beyond happy hour at 5 p.m., and so they adjourn the meeting. And then Luther tells us later, while Master Philip Melanchthon and I were sucking good German beer, God dealt the papacy a mighty blow.
Luther left Worms on April 26, 1521. On May 4th, he and a few of his companions were riding alone on a lonely road when 4 or 5 armed horsemen came up upon the wagon, demanding to see Luther. The driver panicked and he pointed out Luther, and they snatched him.
They grab Luther, who is able to snatch his Greek New Testament and his Hebrew Old Testament as he's getting out of the wagon, and they lead him stumbling up the road.
And they took him away. Luther was kidnapped, but by whom? The papal bull from Leo X excommunicated Luther from the church, but the Edict of Worms from Charles V made Luther an outlaw as well as a heretic. The edict meant that Luther could be killed by anyone, anytime, anywhere without any fear of retribution.